coming. This is Fiat and Framework. So my cursory glance at the room suggests that there is some variation in experience. So I'll try to cater to that as best I can. For those of you who are already fairly accomplished critical debaters or framework debaters, you can think of this as maybe an insight into my psychological profile as a judge, and you can derive some extra utility from that. So, okay. A lecture on Fiat and Framework from the perspective of somebody who only votes for the criticism on average one of every three times he sees it. That would be me. And I don't know that that's necessarily because I'm biased against criticisms. I think that I am, however, strongly biased against poorly articulated criticisms. And this lecture is also given from the perspective of somebody who is, as you may have gathered if you were in my IR lectures, somebody who is trained from a rationalist as opposed to a constructivist or critical perspective. And so I'm someone who largely needs these critical types of arguments spelled out in very clear linear ways, and I think that that's true for a lot of judges. So I guess I would start by telling you ever so briefly the funniest thing that I've ever heard working at a high school debate camp, which is that the permutation is middle fiat. And the reason that the permutation is middle fiat is because the critique is pre-fiat and the plan is post-fiat. Right? So the first thing that I guess I would really want to talk about is getting past this strange pre-post-fiat distinction that we sort of hold on to in this community, and gradually it's changing. But I want to suggest that we are all at this point in our, well, hopefully by this point, we should mostly all be in agreement that the PMC is a speech act and an artifact. So the PMC is an artifact that rests on assumptions about the way that the world is or ought to be ordered. And it is an artifact that is full of discursive constructions and representations of the political world. And now that it's very common to record and post PMCs, it's even easier now to think about PMCs and entire debates as preserved artifacts. That represent the norms of a particular intellectual community, that's us, at a given time. So when you're comparing rounds, when you're comparing these artifacts from different time periods, like if you look at a critical round from this last season as compared to a critical round from like 2004, 2005, you're actually doing a kind of comparative historical research. You're actually tracing the development of a particular intellectual community and the norms in that community. And that's the really great thing about criticisms and about framework arguments, that framework arguments in particular give you an opportunity to say something interesting about debate as an activity and about debate as an intellectual community and what kind of intellectual development it's fostering in its participants. And it gives you an opportunity to make a case for why that type of intellectual development is positive or why it might be harmful. And the criticism on the whole, an argument that says, before we consider the advantages, let's examine whether the assumptions or the representations that are present in the speech act of the PMC, so those assumptions and representations about other people, about other states, about the international environment, about the way that resources are distributed, let's determine whether or not those are valid and whether those are constructive vehicles for social or political change. Yeah?
Tell me if you're going to talk about this later, but could you discuss like different types of framework? Because I think a lot of people think that, oh, framework automatically there's a K and they pull out three sheets.
Yeah, that's
not necessarily true.
Yeah, certainly. So my plan had been to talk mostly about framework from the critical standpoint, but also to talk about it as a mechanism for weighing impacts, even in straight up rounds or non-critical rounds. And also as a mechanism for comparing different types of impacts, say like systemic or structural impacts versus what we're starting to call flashpoint impacts. What the kids these days call flashpoint impacts. So, sure. But I guess because there's a fairly wide variety of experience levels in the room, I would want to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of the basic model of what a criticism looks like. So can somebody just ever so briefly tell me what the major components of a criticism are? Yeah.
Framework, link, impact, and alternative.
Right. And also possibly thesis. Sure. Okay. So my tips for constructing a framework for a critical position, it dovetails with my general advice on selecting a criticism, particularly in the reading that you do beforehand. Generic frameworks for critical positions, I think, are fine, but often they're not especially interesting or of great utility when they're not tailored fairly specifically to the type of impact and alternative arguments that you're making for your criticism. So I would strongly encourage you to consider the positioning of your criticism within debate and think about how framework arguments that you can create will jive with those arguments. So my first piece of advice, I guess, in selecting a criticism and then subsequently writing the framework for that would be pick a topic that interests you, and because you're going to be doing a considerable amount of reading that is going to be going into building a good framework and a good criticism generally. And I guess pursuant to this point, critical authors, you may have noticed, kind of go in and out of style in college debate. And so you don't really need at all to let the community norms determine the domain of ideas that you draw from. So just because a particular author has been very popular this last year or two, or because a very high-profile debater ran, a Gonvin or whatever, that doesn't mean that you should feel any pressure to run similar types of arguments. I think that originality is something that is undervalued in critical debate in Parley, and it's something that I would strongly encourage you to pursue. For example, the zombies. It's original at the very least, and I appreciate that a lot. Also, if you're just starting to write your own framework or starting to put together your own criticisms for the first time, I caution you that some authors are far more accessible than others. David Harvey, who is a very prominent critic of late capitalism, is a lot easier to read than George O'Connell. And so in some cases, starting directly at the source in writing your framework and in writing your criticism is not always advisable. So when an author is known for producing really dense work, I would strongly recommend some certain introduction books. Oxford University Press puts out these really great little books called the Oxford Very Short Introduction to, and then whatever. It might be Derrida, Foucault, I don't know if they have one for Gonvin. But these are really, really helpful, and they also get a really bad rap. But I think it's a lot better to start with a different author's very accessible introduction to someone's ideas, rather than trying to read the main author and then getting frustrated and quitting and doing a different position, even if it doesn't interest you as much. The important thing is that after that you don't remain reliant on introductory books or, even worse, just Wikipedia entries about your author. So once you have a frame of reference, tackling the primary source in writing your framework and writing your criticism is, I think, the next step. I also would caution you that secondary interpretations of your author's main work can be subject to bias and subject to kind of misinterpretation. So choosing introductory books from reputable sources like Oxford University Press, highly advisable. As opposed to, like, I don't know, do they have the complete idiot's guide to critical theory or something? It seems like it might exist. So I would caution against that. Yeah. Sure. So after you familiarize yourself with the authors that you're interested in, be sure that you feel like you grasp their argument well enough to put it into your own words and to understand how it will dovetail with your framework arguments. Because being a good critical debater in parliamentary debate requires the efficient translation of texts that, in my humble and personal opinion, are unnecessarily overwritten at times. It is not an uncommon criticism that some critical authors say in 300 pages what might be more easily expressed in about 100 pages. So being able to translate it efficiently and put it into your own words is going to not only dramatically increase your credibility and your understanding of the argument, but is also going to make it so much easier on your judge. My other little caution is policy backfiles can be helpful in constructing critical positions, or at least thinking about how certain parts of your author's argument can be deployed. I caution against being overly reliant on policy backfiles, because there's great variation in terms of the backfiles that are available. Some are excellent, and some are just terrible. And so, trust yourself as a reader and as a translator, or an interpreter for your author. Okay, so you picked a critical position that you're interested in and that you understand, and now it's time for my Google Doc to stop being really weird and blurry. Uh-oh. That's frustrating. That's just no good. Okay, well, that's fine. So you picked an author that you're interested in, and you're starting to construct a framework. So framework has evolved in parliamentary debate fairly significantly over the last 4 or 5 years. The last 4 or 5 years, parley debate was still kind of hanging on to this. The critique is pre-fiat and the plan is post-fiat, and there is this very strange divide between these two worlds. And now I think framework has become something a little bit different and has become, I think, more nuanced. So as the framework debate was becoming more nuanced in parley, I would say about 2009 and 2010, framework came to be understood as a voting issue, and framework came to be understood as a strategic tool that critical teams can use to exclude the affirmative. So it was common in 2009, 10, maybe somewhat into 2011, for critical teams to have these massive framework arguments that were full of spikes, all of spikes, that were designed to exclude the affirmative's access to their advantages. And it varied the quality of these types of arguments, but probably the best and most enduring argument was that framework is a way to test the representations of the AF, and the AF should be responsible for those representations. It isn't necessarily a matter of the AF losing access to their advantages, but a matter of the affirmative being able to justify the representations present in those advantages before they get to leverage those advantages as strategic tools. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that was fairly common, and then in the last couple of years, framework arguments, at least in my experience, have become shorter and a lot more efficient. And the kind of most enduring set of arguments relate to methodology. That the negative team gets often a conditional test, one conditional test, or maybe multiple conditional tests of the affirmative's methodology, the methodology that is undergirding the representations in the advantages. What are the justifications that you have heard or that you think make sense for a framework that says testing methodology is important and the critique is a valid way to test methodology? Yes?
That bad ways of thinking about a problem necessarily result in embodying the harms that the thesis of the criticism claims tacitly occur in the studies?
Sure, absolutely. So the classic bad methodology leads to bad policy eventually. And there are, the quality of examples or warrants behind this argument vary as well. I've noticed a slight trend where we think that we've moved past the need to warrant this argument, and just merely the claim bad methodology leads to bad policy, next argument is sufficient. So I would caution you against that. I would also think about, say, suppose that you were running a criticism of, the international, a particular lens of the international system, so a criticism of realism, something like that. Is anybody familiar with something called enduring rivalries theory? So it's this kind of interesting theory in IR that the overwhelming majority of interstate wars have actually occurred along the same conflict dyads. So it's the same small set of countries fighting each other over and over again that accounts for all of the war that we see in the international system.
What's the theory called?
It's called enduring rivalries theory. What might be the implication for a worldview like realism, if that's true? So if you think about it, the international system says, or realism says international system is anarchic, and that causes states to seek self-help and eventually go to war with one another because of things like the security dilemma, or because of all states' inherent desire to achieve hegemony. So the implication of the empirical reality of enduring rivalries, so it's just the same small groups of states fighting over and over again, means that the international system by and large actually isn't anarchic and violent. It means that it's just a couple of states doing that. And so the realist lens, or the realist worldview, systematically overestimates the prevalence of war in the international system, which means that there is a need for a different lens, or a different understanding. And so that would be an example of bad methodology culminating in bad policy, because if the worldview of realism infiltrates academic hierarchy, academic elite circles, or policy-making circles, particularly in foreign policy, that is a flawed methodology, flawed worldview, that is leading to a flawed and ultimately destructive understanding of the international system. So it would be an example of bad methodology leading to bad policy. So gradually, in the development of framework arguments in critical debate, less has been focused on these, big long spiky frameworks. Although they still exist. More some fairly straightforward and fairly intuitive arguments about the appropriateness of testing the affirmative's methodology. And if the affirmative is able to pass that test of their methodology, then their representation, or prove that their representations are valid, then they should get access to those impacts, those advantages. And so, what do you think the response has been from affirmative teams? If the test has changed from, let's see how many policy-making or role-playing good arguments we can throw at the framework, to we just have to pass a simple test of methodology, justify our representations. How do you think affirmative teams have responded to that? So yeah, permutations, but permutations were common all throughout. So my feeling, or my sense has been that debates have become less theoretical and more empirical in their justification for methodologies. So affirmative teams will point to historical examples, or will outline fairly obvious incentive structures of whatever actors and whatever system they're critiquing, and they will say that, well, in this period in history, this occurred. This is empirical evidence that our worldview is correct. And that is a historical justification, a historical evidence-based justification for our methodology. And sometimes, even more simply, I think really smart MGs will say the causal structures in our advantage, so the link and internal link arguments, are so good and well crafted and largely conceded by the LOC that those internal link arguments, those causal mechanism arguments, are the justification for our methodology, which is kind of cool and really straightforward and really simple. So the way that critical teams, I think increasingly are starting to get around that are by making arguments in the framework that suggest that none of the truth claims, so the claims about how the world works in the app, can be trusted, because they're contaminated by a flawed worldview, which sort of takes away that ability for the affirmative team to just kind of insist on their internal link arguments and their advantages. Another fairly common thing that you will find either in framework arguments, but most commonly in impact scenarios in critical teams, root cause of all violence. Root cause of all violence claims. I love these claims. I love these arguments because, my God, it was so simple. How did we not see that there was simply one variable that accounts for global violence? Thank you. Yeah, so root cause of all violence claims. Sorry for the flippancy. I'm a tad skeptical of these types of arguments because they tend to be the least warranted arguments in impact scenarios, which is strange because it's the biggest claim sometimes with the least warranting. Or sometimes the warranting is something like you have to create in-groups and out-groups before you can do any sort of violence, or you have to exclude some ideas or concepts or intellectual communities or communities of people or actions before you can do violence to them. So while on a very, very broad level, that might be the case, and your mind will immediately go to instances where that is true. I think the flip side to that argument is it creates a fear or a paralysis about excluding ideas that are bad or intellectual traditions that are bad, which is not a progressive way of understanding. So I guess my advice to you is, if you are going to go for root cause of violence claims, warrant them out extremely well. Because more and more MGs are realizing that root cause of all violence claims have enabled MOs to stand up and say they conceded that X is the root cause of all violence. Our alternative deconstructs X. We only have to win the slightest risk that we dismantle X, and then we solve for the root cause of all violence, which also means we solve for the F. So MGs are falling for that, I think, less frequently, which means that if you're going to do root cause of violence arguments in your framework figure impact scenarios, I would strongly recommend that you warrant them out a lot. So point is, framework has evolved from a not so nuanced understanding of these two worlds to a mechanism that was meant to trick or exclude the affirmative team, and now it's moving something more like framework as a gatekeeper. Not framework as a voting issue, but something more like framework as a gatekeeper. So framework that justifies the existence of the criticism without necessarily denying the affirmatives access to their advantages. And then the debate actually takes place on the link and impact level. The other thing that has occurred, I think, as a result of this shift in how framework is run in parliamentary debate, is that impact turning has become a more frequent practice. Rather than just straight framework arguments and permutations, impact turning from the MG, and making arguments that the impact turns and the causal mechanisms underlying the impact turn arguments are justifications for the affirmatives methodology and also should guarantee the affirmative access to their advantages for those reasons. Which I think is great. I love impact turn debates, but that's just a personal preference. Okay. So, you had asked for some discussion of framework arguments outside of critical arguments. So, what exactly would you like to hear me talk about?
I don't know. I know my partner and I would played around with how to specifically frame net benefits. So we had what we thought a strategic way to frame benefits. So a lot of other teams waste their time through the impacts and stuff.
Yeah.
But just different things like that, right? So how to do that, or other types of arguments like that, how they kind of
Sure. Okay, so one, I think, really smart thing that increasingly teams are doing, and this is not necessarily critical teams writing their framework arguments, is so framework at its most kind of fundamental level is just a series of arguments about how to prioritize impacts, right? That's true on the critical level. That's true on the policy or the straight up level. So, as I think you all realize, there seem to be, in general, two schools of impact arguments. Those that impact out to extinction, and those that impact out to dehumanization. And dehumanization is, of course, what?
Worse than death.
It is not only worse than death, but it is also it rhymes with root cause of all violence. Yes, root cause of all violence, exactly. And therefore is a prerequisite to understanding the extinction scenario. Okay, so that's fine, but the question is, what mechanisms allow you to get to those types of major extinction scenarios that come with dissonance? So let's say that you're constructing an affirmative and you have a pretty good sense that you're not really going to be able to claim a credible impact scenario. It's maybe a small app that only improves quality of life for a couple of people. So you feel it's a little bit easier to get to dehumanization impacts than it is to get to nuclear annihilation impacts. Fair enough. But you are at great risk for getting outweighed potentially by dissonance, especially if your plan is something that would be politically unpopular and for some reason would trigger a nuclear war, right? So you're at risk for getting outweighed. So how do you structure your framework arguments at the top? How do you tell the judge early to evaluate those impacts in order to avoid getting outweighed really easily by preposterous internal link scenarios? Well, it's easy to think of categorizing these impacts: systemic impacts or structural impacts, and flashpoint impacts. And flashpoint impacts has become sort of a shorthand for some small change in the status quo, something that ever so slightly throws life or political interaction out of equilibrium, creates this rapid chain of events where somewhere a war starts, and then that war grows gradually until it kills everybody. So that's the shorthand for that is the flashpoint impact. So if you have an app that is impacting mostly dehumanization and is related to the quality of life of a relatively small group of people, and you are concerned that you are going to get a bunch of disads thrown at you with flashpoint impacts, think about how to explain to the judge why systemic impacts, or impacts that relate to the structural violence of whatever political system your actors happen to be involved in, should come first and outweigh. And you can think about it in terms of probability, in terms of magnitude. So, and in terms of empirical validity as well. Okay, so what would be some reasons why flashpoint impacts, those interstate war impacts, should not be privileged above, say, dehumanization impacts that are smaller scale, but more systemic?
They never happen.
Yeah, they never happen. So why don't they ever happen? So the FP flashpoint impacts don't happen. Why? Yeah.
Because we would know, sort of, if they happened.
Well, yeah, for sure. Yeah, right. So I'm thinking a little bit more in terms of like what variables or what mechanisms prevent those flashpoint impacts from happening. Because you're definitely correct that if these flashpoint impact chains of reasoning were true, it probably should have happened already, because God knows a fair number of policies that get debated in college debate get passed, and very little occurs in terms of, like, setting off flashpoint impacts.
Rational actors.
Okay, so rationality of actors means cost of war too high. Right? Elites prefer to peacefully bargain as opposed to going to war. So another element of that argument would be something like, there should be enough things that can disrupt that chain of mechanisms that get you to war before war actually occurs. The way that I try to explain this to my students is, think about for a second that impact scenario, the internal link chain that's going to nuclear war. The fact that that is even the slightest possibility, right, like the fact that you thought of it, is probably also an indicator that policymakers have thought about it and have thought about how to prevent it. So the fact that the impact scenario exists in your mind is a reason that the impact scenario will never happen. Does that make sense? It's kind of a weird way of explaining that. But basically, the argument is that elites with interest in avoiding war will prevent the worst. So that can come from things like international organizations that have, or at least claim to have, dispute resolution mechanisms that would prevent war. Or think about all of the times that it feels like two states or two major actors are on the brink of war, or tensions are very high, and somebody who's very, very popular with the rest of the world goes and negotiates a settlement. Or at least tries to negotiate a settlement and delays the war for long enough that an alternative solution can be figured out. So IOs, intermediaries, lots of things can intervene in order to prevent those flashpoint impacts from coming to fruition.
But these are more like case arguments almost, rather than something. I don't feel like you frame it as a framework. Like, I'm giving my PMC, and I know my advantages are all like systemic and preventing just like local dehumanization. So I'm like, look, don't accept the negatives, extinction or nuclear war because of like these reasons. Like I don't feel like that would like this is how you would probably word it.
Okay. So you may choose to word it slightly differently, and I think I kind of understand your reticence about it, because it seems like these would be just a bunch of generic, like no internal link or no impact arguments, but they're not really contextualized to the particular impact scenario, which is what I think makes them valuable as thinking in general terms of systemic impacts over flashpoint impacts as a framework. It also enables you to make kind of macro-historical arguments about why these types of flashpoint impacts don't happen, and use them in round after round against a wide variety of flashpoint impacts that all feature different actors and different causal mechanisms, which I think is the value of this type of framework, systemic impact framework. So I also think that you're right, though, that these are reasons why flashpoint impacts don't happen, not in and of themselves justifications for why systemic impact should come first. So we'll get to that in a second. But some of the other, real quick, common arguments about why flashpoint impacts don't happen, similar to the cost of war too high. Things like mutually assured destruction means that nuclear war never occurs. Economic interdependence means that nuclear war never happens. Also, fairly common one, economic collapse leads to resource wars, which result in nuclear wars. So some reasons why that's probably not the case. First off, in the event of a major and I guess kind of instantaneous global economic collapse, states would probably not be able to raise the tax revenue necessary to have standing armies, and so there would probably be things like mass desertions, as states can't provide food for their armies, so the wars would probably be a lot shorter. It also doesn't make sense that there would be nuclear exchanges, because why would anybody contaminate the resources that they're fighting over with nuclear weapons? Also, states are probably not going to become highly adventurous in a time of great uncertainty. Elites become very conservative in times of uncertainty, which means that they're going to be focused on providing for their populations based on the resources that they have, rather than expending lots of resources to go abroad and try to grab resources in a highly uncertain environment where it's possible that they could lose. Also, it doesn't really make very much sense, because if you think about it, what would probably happen is, rather than the United States and China fighting over resources, they would probably just divvy up the spheres of influence that they have now, because that would enable for far more peaceful extraction of resources if everybody could just agree on a sphere of influence. Say, okay, we'll get oil from Venezuela, you get oil from Saudi Arabia, and we'll get these minerals from here, you get this food from there. In a time of great uncertainty where there's a prospect of global war, that seems like a much more likely way for elites to act. But, like you correctly say, these are not justifications in and of themselves for systemic impacts. So why do systemic impacts come first? Why are they more important to evaluate? Not just because these are, highly implausible and empirically invalid.
Because they have logical, historical warrants of having occurred over time and continuing to occur.
For sure. Okay, so there's much greater empirical validity which would also indicate that there's much higher probability, to put it in terms that we're familiar with for impact occurrence. But what else?
When we continually focus on high magnitude, low probability impacts, then we just push to the side continuously the high probability, low magnitude impacts, because we're focusing on extinction scenario after potential extinction scenario. And that leads to them being ignored.
Yeah, so it's definitely true that they get ignored, that the systemic impacts get ignored. But to put it in terms of magnitude, think about all of the people that have been harmed by structural violence or systemic violence over a certain time period versus all of the people who have died in a nuclear war. Right? It's not to suggest that, the nuclear annihilation of Nagasaki and Hiroshima or the nuclear annihilation of the Western Shoshone people is not important, but thinking about it just in terms of magnitude, think of all the people who have died from structural violence or from systemic impacts over, maybe the same period from 1945 to the present, it will outweigh the number of people who died in a nuclear attack. So you can also understand it in terms of magnitude, but it's magnitude from a different temporal perspective.
So it'd be like comparing the fear of death by shark to the reality of how many people die getting hit by a car on the way to the grocery store.
Yeah. That's an especially appropriate one now. I guess Shark Week just ended,
Right.
didn't it? Okay.
So if their terminal impact is the Sharknado.
Right, exactly. So the magnitude from a different temporal perspective or a different time frame perspective, but a time frame perspective that is not just justified by a competitive assertion, but rather a time frame perspective that has empirical validity and is justified by empirical validity. So yeah.
This might go over here though, but like it forces us into inaction. If we like accept the risk that nuclear war can happen pretty much with anything that we do, then it will like force maybe we won't just do anything. Like always consider these 0.0001% chance over.
Right. So not only can it force sort of paralysis that allows for this magnitude of impacts, but also if those impacts are truly systemic, as in they are integral to the nature of the political system or the system of the distribution of resources that you're engaged in, it lets you ignore your role in the system of violence. And it makes you equally culpable for the violence that occurs. So there's also a culpability issue, or a culpability argument to be made. And of course, if you don't understand violence within yourself or your role in perpetuating systems of structural violence, then it continues in perpetuity. Okay, so those are some further justifications for why systemic impacts before flashpoint impacts that can be used in straight up affirmatives that help prevent the risk of getting outweighed. I want to back up real quickly. Oh yeah.
I just had a question. So if you had these type of impacts, do you have to run this framework every time, or is it a better idea? Or
Oh, you don't need to. I would strongly recommend it, and the reason that I recommend it is that putting it as a framework argument in the PMC, so at the beginning of the PMC, lets the MG very quickly extend the arguments, rather than the MG having to do a ton of impact analysis and impact comparison. So they can focus more on, let's say like the link level of the dissat, or the uniqueness level of the dissat. And the other kind of good thing about that is the faster that you get the systemic impact arguments out, or those impact comparison framework out, the lower the probability that the PMR is going to get accused of making new arguments in the framing of the impacts. So you get to say from the PMR, we have been saying from the beginning for 5 reasons systemic impacts come first. The LOC never really interacted with these arguments, which means that you privilege RF even if there is a small, minute risk of nuclear war. Does that make sense? Okay.
And since systemic impacts seem to have more of a real-world effect, we still want to, in our advantages or disadvantages, we still want to go out to the terminal high magnitude flashpoint impacts towards the end, right? Or
well, I mean,
from a strategic standpoint?
I'm reluctant to say absolutely yes or no. Certainly some teams who feel like hedging their bets will go all the way out to the nuclear extinction scenario, but that wouldn't really jive with this framework argument, with these framework arguments that you're making. The other problem is that if you're already going to be making these framework arguments, it seems like to get from dehumanization to extinction or nuclear annihilation, you have to do so much more internal link work in the PMC that it almost, my immediate reaction is that as a PMC it would make more sense to read the systemic impacts first over flashpoint impacts and then only have systemic impacts, because you're going to, what you're really doing is you're undercutting the link claims, the internal link claims of the dissats. So I will say it is your choice, but for the sake of consistency, and I also kind of think for the sake of efficiency as well as credibility, I would probably put the systemic impact framework on top and probably not go all the way out to extinction. But that's, again, a personal preference. And if you don't feel comfortable with that, if you just you're so accustomed to having extinction impacts that you need to say extinction at the very end. That's okay. Anything else before I go on? Okay. So something that I wanted to back up and mention, and this is I guess sort of related to the empirical validity argument here. So this is kind of back to critical debate for a second. In a lot of the framework arguments that I've seen that I have really liked in the last year, the framework arguments ascribe a very particular role to the judge. So it's not just telling the judge that you value these types of impacts before these types of impacts. It's that you as the judge are supposed to, you have an intellectual responsibility to account for something like systemic violence. Like, for example, the judge is, I think I've heard the judge is historian, which is an argument that I really like because the judge, as a historian, is supposed to account for the historical processes that create systemic violence or create structural violence. Because without that type of macro historical understanding, those impacts are doomed to be repeated. I think that's especially useful with arguments that relate to, like criticisms of colonialism, that the historical perspective and the judge understanding him or herself as somebody, I evaluate the arguments that give the best historical explanation or perspective for the systemic impacts that I see around me, because that's the truest understanding of why those impacts exist. I think that giving a very particular intellectual role to a judge is a really great way of structuring framework. It's a really cool framework. Yeah.
How can you warrant that distillation of the role of the ballot? I feel like I would do a very bad job of that.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, so if the point of debate, it starts with an assumption, I think, that if the point of debate is to understand and prevent the processes that cause violence and that cause human suffering, which some people would disagree that that's not the point of debate, but so it starts with that assumption, and I think it's a decent assumption. It's one that you can at least justify. Then the historical perspective, or whatever perspective you're offering, the feminist perspective or whatever, if you can prove via your thesis, your link arguments, that perspective best accounts for the violence that we see and the systemic violence that we see, the structures of violence that we see, then if that's the one that provides the best understanding, it's probably also the one that provides for the best strategies for destroying those systems of violence. Does that make sense? So that's how I think you would warrant out the theory behind that perspective. So another thing, because occasionally you will still see teams who justify their methodology or justify their access to their impacts by just straight role-playing good. Fiat good, role-playing good arguments. Those are fine arguments, and so you should think about maybe how to preempt them a little bit in your framework. So I think fairly frequently, not always, but fairly frequently, these types of debates came down to issues of fairness. Gradually that's shifting, and it's becoming less of a fairness issue and more of a quality of education issue, which I think is probably good. So some of the kind of common reasons that you'll hear as justifications for the role-playing perspective, so real-world education, right, is a kind of classic one. That when you adopt a lens of a policymaker, you must obviously, because you have as much information as that policymaker, of course, then you're kind of effectively seeing the world through the eyes of that policymaker, and you understand their decision-making processes better, so that when you graduate from college and you stop debating, and you go on to control the levers of power in the United States federal government, you can make better decisions, right? Real-world topic-specific education. So that's a fairly kind of classic justification. I think that building in some preempts in your critical framework is desirable. So you'll fairly frequently hear claims that the criticism is a representation of a marginalized form of education, and that marginalized education needs to be prioritized above the kind of mainstream policymaking sort of education. I also kind of like the argument that the policy education that the affirmative is seeking or is claiming to be good is available outside of debate, whereas debate is a unique forum for presentations of marginalized education or critical perspectives. So everything that you could possibly want to know about policymaking can be learned in a college classroom, which everybody in debate theoretically has access to, right? Because you're college debaters. Whereas parliamentary debate is a pretty cool thing because it's a forum where the only thing that you get are your representations and your words, right? Those are the only things that you really have control over, and how those words shape your understanding of the world, that's all you really ever leave debate with, especially now that we aren't giving out as many trophies because they're expensive, and sometimes they're just gaudy. They just look bad. So it's increasingly the only thing that you really leave with, so that's the type of education that you should privilege. You get a constantly shifting set of words that you're asked to ascribe meaning to. The meaning that you ascribe is sort of indicative or representative of your worldview. We should use this as an opportunity to test the validity of your worldview. The assumptions behind your representations, your worldview. Test the methodology. So the type of education that the policymaking folks want is both available elsewhere and possibly very bad education, if the thesis of our criticism is true. So we shouldn't desire it in the first place. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions, thoughts, comments, concerns about framework?